Martin Luther King would have had a lot in common with the Benedictine tradition had he had the opportunity to visit St. Vincent or a college like this. He believed in freedom, and he believed deeply in the role of religion in society, and that it played an important role in transforming men's hearts and making governments more responsive and democratic. That's what the Benedictine tradition encourages. He believed in a liberal education in the classical sense, not the political liberal sense. And so I think it's fitting that St. Vincent would try to honor his legacy, because I think it builds on what the Benedictine tradition is all about. So I thought I would talk today about freedom, and inspired by a speech he gave in the late 1950s after Nkrumah pushed hard and succeeded in having Ghana gain its independence. The I Have a Dream speech is so well known, and it was great to hear that clip of it. It's still very moving. But what most people don't know is that King, though he died in his late 30s, was a prolific writer, that he wrote more than the most prolific American presidents who lived longer than he did. He wrote his speeches at a level of detail and based on research and reflection that I don't think most ministers do today. Copies of all of his papers are at Stanford University, with the originals being in Atlanta at the King Center. So the speech that he gave was really about freedom in the late 1950s. And I thought, what a time to think about freedom. And when you look at the words that he wrote, it could have been written by Ronald Reagan, by Harry Truman, by a whole host of American political figures, because he talked about the fact that freedom is so difficult. It's a continual struggle, and you never truly achieve it. And he also talked about the fact that freedom is a global struggle, not just one for the United States. So he tried to embed in that speech the American experience, in the experience of Gandhi's India, of Nkrumah's Ghana, and a host of other countries. And so I wanted to reflect today on what does it mean to be a free society, and how do we try to be that, given that our rankings on various economic and political freedom indices seems to be ranking. For most of my lifetime, the U.S. was considered the most free country in the world on political and economic indices, not today. And why is that the case? What do we have to do to be a free society at the level that we would like to be once again? So I looked back at some of contemporary American history and some in the past, and thought about what helped to make us be free, and I'd like to share that with you today. One, I think a restoration, and everyone will agree with this, of a kind of bipartisan spirit and civility is needed again for a free society. I don't think we can underestimate the corrosive effect of what's happened in our nation's capital to the optimism of young people about government service, about for those around the world that have always looked to the U.S. As a beacon. The political stalemate that exists has not produced the kinds of free institutions that came out of the U.S. starting in 1945 as World War II ended. We got the United Nations, which, whether you agree with all that it does, and many have said, well, it's just a debating society, it doesn't do very much. No one would say it's not an important force in the global system, if for no other reason that it makes those who want to go to war be very careful, and they have to slow down and make their case there. That's a huge achievement to have an institution like that. Then the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the most durable security alliance, an Atlantic alliance that has existed really in world history. There's been none like it. And its purpose during the Cold War, when it was founded in 1949, was to block Soviet encroachment into Western Europe. But even after the fall of the Soviet Union, membership in NATO has continued to grow, and it is an important force in the world. We could not have been involved in Libya, for example, in that campaign without the organizing activities around NATO. So a structure of international cooperation was created to help build a free society, both internationally and domestically, in the 1940s. And then, of course, we had the end of the Cold War, by the late 1980s and early 1990s. And for those who like to say on the conservative side, it was Reagan's strength and it was bombs and bullets and trade and commerce that ultimately toppled the Soviet Union. I think it was the ideas about freedom that attracted so many people in the Soviet system. The Russian people understood what it meant to live in a free society based on what they were hearing and reading through Radio Free Europe, through all of the ways in which the West was penetrating the Soviet system. We did some remarkable things in the 20th century to advance freedom in the world. A bipartisan Congress did all of these things, and an America that had a lot more civility than it does right now. Also, I think because the world has changed so much, and in the past it was the Soviet Union or a possibly increasing China in the world, we didn't worry so much about certain types of threats, but now we have a different type of threat that it has a fundamental capacity to hurt freedom in the West and the rest of the world. That's radical Islam. Part of the problem, though, in Washington, because it is so stratified and ineffective, we can't have an honest conversation about radical Islam. We can't use the term because it then seems like you're saying something negative about people of the Muslim faith. But indeed, there are forces that seek to destroy the West, and they say so every single day, and they mean it. And they've had some success, but we as an organized society have often blocked them as well. So I think updating what we mean by the West and what it means to survive against a transnational set of threats that aren't rooted in any particular country like a China or a Russia or an India, but a set of forces that cut across many parts of the world from North Africa down to Yemen. And how do we figure out our own solutions about saving the West against radical Islam, which also, by the way, seeks to discredit, harm, and destroy Christianity. Also, as I was looking back, I thought about the size of government, and that's something that Americans have always been concerned about. Our first Constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, is an embarrassing document in limited government, so limited that something like the Shays Rebellion could not be dealt with. It was so limited it gave almost no power to the central authority. Power still inherent in the colony/states. It couldn't call up an effective militia. There were numerous currencies, so there was rampant inflation, separate foreign policies. That was the original model in the United States of what government should be like, as limited as possible. We then realized we couldn't exist in this growing nation under a constitution that barely functioned, and we got our current constitution. But even there, we have something called the Bill of Rights, which is an attempt to save part of those limited government aspects that existed in the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So that's the debate we're in right now with the NSA scandal and their metadata that they have from our phone logs and so forth. It's about the First and the Fourth Amendments, part of the Bill of Rights. How do we keep government limited? So that's become a political issue, but actually it's an empirical fact. Americans started their country with this whole notion of limited government. But that doesn't mean that government's not important and it doesn't have a role to play in our lives. For example, after World War II, probably until around 1975, in part due to the Soviets launching Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the Earth, the federal government, especially the Defense Department, put billions of dollars, it had never been done in world history, from a government to American universities. And during those years, the American university got radically transformed. We are still living in the legacy of what the federal government did during that period. It shouldn't even be a political issue or a partisan issue. It was the federal government that put billions of dollars for unclassified research in the hard sciences, but also in the humanities and social sciences, really before that money came from the federal government. We didn't have departments that we now, and whole schools of computer science and engineering, and if you took language in college, it was probably Latin, German, and French, and a course. There weren't huge departments of modern languages or Slavic languages. That was due to the federal government. There is a proper role for government in national readiness, and transforming universities, and trying to get back to something like the ecosystem that existed between government and universities that made Silicon Valley possible. It would not exist without the federal government. I think is something that we have to revisit. How do we get back to the use of government in this important way? Also, I think we need to restore in Congress the proper function of the House and Senate. The Senate is supposed to be a body of trustees who are more contemplative, who look over their whole state, and they vote in terms of something more objective like the national interest, because they have a 6-year term, and there are fewer of them. And then the House members are supposed to be delegates, where they stay closer to their constituents and they try to vote to the preferences of their constituents, and they have to run every 2 years. Part of what we're experiencing in Washington now is that the House and Senate behave similarly. They're both delegates and there are no trustees. There's no one watching over the national interest, partly because of political money. They have to run, even if you're running for 6 years now, campaigns are so expensive. Some Senate campaigns are what presidential campaigns used to cost, so it doesn't allow members to actually govern. They're spending most of their time campaigning, and campaigning and governance are very different. How we fix that problem, I don't exactly know, but I think it blocks our ability to be a free society because it ends up encouraging a small class of people, multimillionaires, to run for office because they're the only ones who can afford to take a hiatus from the private sector or from whatever else they're doing. I also think we need to make Congress do its job in terms of its oversight function under Article I authority of the Constitution, that it needs to oversee the various agencies of the executive branch that it in fact helps create. And one of the reasons that members don't want to do their oversight responsibility is because they're going to face an election soon. And if they get too political in really doing their job, it could hurt them in the election. All of this, I think, makes us less democratic and a lot more political. Something that President Obama is doing, I think, is absolutely right. He's trying to understand how to reduce the size of the executive branch. And he thinks that the executive branch has too much power. So that's part of the reason that he hemmed and hawed on whether he should go to Syria and all of these hot spots around the world. He's trying to understand why the executive branch has been allowed to become really acting as an Article I a branch of government instead of being the second branch of government. I think there's something healthy there. The main problem is that, as I said earlier, freedom is a global struggle. And when the United States, as the predominant military power on earth, we have nearly 50% of defense spending comes out of the US. When we don't move, bad guys move in. That's the story of Syria now. It would be almost impossible for the US to do anything because we've let 200,000 people get killed in a war that's in its 3rd year. I understand the constitutional issues that the president's worried about, but also if we don't help protect global freedom, no other country on earth is actually poised or positioned to do it. We have the best fighters in the world because we've been fighting wars for more than a decade, more so than anyone else. We know how to fight, we know how to win, but we have to provide leadership to protect global freedom. I don't think that we're doing that now. I also think that we have to look internally at our country because freedom has its internal and external dimensions. The United States has never really had a serious conversation about race. And when I mean race, I mean black, white. It's never happened, and it's so important for the future because the black vote is the lead indicator for all of the non-white votes because blacks were the first non-whites to vote in the United States, and they were the ones who were enslaved. We haven't had a conversation of what it means to have a legacy of slavery in the country and how it continues to affect the institutions and society, demographic factors. It's so fundamental to who we are, and a disappointment for me in this administration, even after Trayvon Martin, when the president wondered aloud and said, I'm going to do something on race, we've yet to see it. Partly perhaps because he's been so bogged down in scandal after scandal. But until I think we get the race issue right between black and white, I don't think the rest of America can move. And it's important for immigrants, too, to see that dyad addressed because I think they get a false understanding of the role of black people in this country because we haven't addressed that fundamental issue of the impact, the lasting impact of slavery in the United States. I also think, though, I've just said these things, we should celebrate our successes. And we are the first country in the world to figure out how to be a fully functioning multi-ethnic democracy. India is the biggest democracy in the world, but we're the most fully functioning multi-ethnic democracy. We got the Reconstruction after the Civil War, and it took about 100 years to get the civil rights legislation and the Voting Rights Act, but we did it. That was landmark legislation. Nothing in the world had been done like it before in terms of civil rights. It seems very basic when you read it, being able to sit at a lunch counter, but other societies had not done it. We were the most democratic country at the time in the mid-1960s when Congress passed that legislation, and in some ways we still are. But we have a lot of work to do, but I think we don't sometimes slow down and understand what King was talking about and how hard that fight actually was. And it was a global struggle, but everyone looks to the American experience of civil rights to begin to understand what it means to live in a free society. And we also need to understand better the global struggles that I just mentioned around the world. Syria is, to me, ground zero for what's going to happen in the world on issues of freedom. The direction that Syria goes is going to have a big impact for the broader Middle East. And we have to, I think, admit that we're in a global war on terror. The Obama administration has scrubbed that language from a lot of the counterterrorism documents, but Al-Qaeda is clearly resurgent. This isn't a point of debate, it's a reality, and it's about to topple the Iraqi regime. It's dominating Syria, the al-Nusra Front, Yemen, North Africa, all the way down to sub-Saharan Africa. These are fundamental threats under a different type of al-Qaeda organization that's probably better organized, more effective than when Osama bin Laden started his organization. So I think coming to grips with the fact that we are in a global war and what that means is fundamental for the United States. I think we also need to look at some of the factors, since we are on a King holiday, that I think have held African Americans back in the United States. And that is being hijacked by the Democratic Party. No demographic or sector of society should give its vote to one political party every time there's a presidential election, no matter what that candidate does. When you diversify your political power, you have more power. When you are hijacked by a political machine, you are disregarded. And that's going to be important, I think, for African Americans in the future. For the first 60 or 70 years or so of black voting from Lincoln into the next century, the party for African Americans was the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, the Abolitionist Party. There's a legacy there that's important for African Americans to really tap into, because, again, to be hijacked is to become irrelevant. And I think that contributes to the absence of a national conversation about race. Also, I think we should look at the fact that there's a new Middle East. And I've talked already a bit about Syria. But when you look at the Saudis and the potential for a nuclear arms race, if Iran gets something close to a nuclear weapon, the changes in the Persian Gulf, the demands on the United States are just going to be fundamental. So while the current administration is pivoting to Asia, that's its term, the Middle East is going up in flames. And if the U.S. does not play a central role, especially in the Levant, in the Middle East, Russia will come back, and it already has. It had been expelled by Egypt in the early 1970s, and Putin has reemerged in Russia, in Egypt, and in the Middle East. The Middle East is the center of so much of U.S. national interest, and I think it's important that the U.S. become much more clear about the Middle East. Also, I think it's important that we figure out how to block war, and that's not easy, but there are ways that it can be done. And what St. Vincent is doing under the leadership of Brother Norman and Archabbot Nowicki is actually important for blocking war in the future. There is a way in which the study of the humanities and social sciences can inform the decisions we make about war. I can tell you that since I was involved on Don Rumsfeld's Defense Policy Board in the early 2000s, that we did not talk about before going into Iraq the potential for a Shia revival in a Sunni minority country under Saddam Hussein, right next to the heart of the Shia revival in Iran. What would actually happen in Iraq? That wasn't a factor in the discussion. It was GPS jammers, all kinds of technology issues, can we prevail in war, but not what was actually going on in a country where you have better than 60% Shia and what it would mean for them to finally get rid of a government that had always oppressed them. The humanities and social sciences are vital to America's future on these issues. So much in most universities, it's the engineering side and computer science that gets the money and the resources. But political people, policy people actually decide wars. Technologists don't. The CTO, CIO, these are relatively new acronyms, but they're not these posts are rarely people that end up in a president's cabinet. So for better or worse, those who are on the side of the humanities and social sciences are going to be the deciders of war in the future. And for the US, since we are the predominant military force in the world, we're going to need people that know language and culture in a way that we never have before. There are many other issues that I'd like to talk about, and I hope that we have a kinder conversation in the United States. I think cable TV has hurt. I do a lot of cable TV, both MSNBC and Fox and others, and I think it's hurting the capacity to have a national conversation because of the disloyal way in which the conversations take place and the ill-informed producers of those programs. King would have thought about all of these issues, I think, and he would have been both encouraged that we're here today with this multi-ethnic audience, which is not staged for St. Vincent. This is the community in which you inherit. But he would have been worried about freedom and the struggle and how delicate it is and how hard it is. And so that's what I leave, especially the young people here with tonight, is to understand as much as possible that what you're doing is vital for a free society, and we're giving it over to you in the next decade. I hope you will protect it better than we have in my generation. Thank you so much.